Welcome to Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. I'm your host, Marianne Baton, and I'm welcoming today Dr. Bill Howatt. Bill is the president and founder of Howatt HR. He's the author of The Cure for Loneliness and a new book that's coming out soon that he's going to tell you about. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you. Welcome. So nice to be here, Marianne. How are you?
I am good. I want you to start off with telling us a little bit about how you first even learned about the concept psych health and safety.
You know what? All the interviews I've been asked, no one's ever asked me this question. They asked me why I got into mental health, but no one's ever asked me how I got into this. And this is a fantastic question for me. So in all transparency, I'm someone who started in the field of mental health as a practitioner. And I started out in a world of forensic psychology, doing a lot of folks who are having trouble with the law, and I specialized a lot with addictive disorders. And I was young and I had a young family. And one of the challenges when you're working with high-risk populations that are vulnerable is having support systems. So one of the things I used to find is folks would come out of jail. And I think it's really important. A lot of the individuals that spend time in jail are not really evil, bad, sociopathic, psychotic people. A lot of them, the way they were brought up, their opportunities. Like I was adopted, I was in a foster home. If I didn't get good parents, I know I could have had a different path. So I was really interested in helping that population. And to be quite transparent, after about 12 years, I was in Hawaii, and it's kind of a funny story. I was in Hawaii golfing. And I ended up getting invited to come do some stuff in HR and in North Carolina. And when I went back and talked to my wife at the time, and I said to her, I go, I love what I do. That I'm passionate about mental health. That I care about addictions. I love teaching, but it's an anthill. And it's so big, I don't know if I'm having any impact one at a time. And I believe by the time they get to me, there's already a challenge. Surely there's something we can do better or different. And all the folks that I was working with EFAP was work related. So I said, I wonder if I get in the world of HR and start trying to do things around programs and I had no idea about psych safety at the time, to be honest. Zero. Just figured that it's a culture and the experience. Instead of it working with one person at a time, I could work with large groups of people. So I got involved in becoming a CHRO in a large dental practice in North Carolina. We had about 20 years. Can't remember, a lot of different dentists. And I didn't really know anything about HR except I knew a little bit about people. And I got along with the dentist really well. And I did some coaching with the dentist. So that kind of got me into it. But where my evolution, where it's kind of happened, I ended up in Wall Street. And Wall Street's a very competitive environment where people come to work and there's high expectations on them. I was very fortunate to end up working with, he was the CEO of Bear Stearns. He's now a chairman of board somewhere else. And he's an ex-baseball player and he really understood team sports. And he really was a competitively driven, wanted results, he wanted outcomes, but he knew it had to be done through people. Again, I didn't know anything about psych safety at the time. But one of the things I did know about was Deming's original work on total quality management, about removing fear. And being an ex-football coach, I used to say to the CEO, I said, something, when an offensive lineman makes a mistake, I don't have to scream at him. He already knows he made a mistake. When I coach football at university, I said, I've learned by having conversations where people feel safe and we can talk back and forth instead of we might be able to help drive some fear out and create some trust and some loyalty. So I ended up spending 12 years learning how to do management and senior leadership and culture stuff, working in a competitive environment. So then I retired when I was 50, thinking that, I had a great career. I did well, okay. And I came back to Canada and I lasted about a month and I got involved with the Globe and Mail. I started writing and we created an online tool. And it was interesting that, no one really believed. I said, well, let's start asking employees what they think about their workplace experience. And the editor went to me, so how many questions are you going to ask? And I said, oh, a few. And they said, well, like, can you show me? And it was like 90 questions. They said, Bill, no one's ever going to answer this. I said, let's try. I'll just do it. So we ended up answering it, doing it, and we had 12,000 respondents. So that tool, we evolved it, and that led me to moving to Morneau Chappelle, becoming the chief of research. And we ended up taking that tool and we recreated another tool called the Total Health Index, which I eventually sold to Morneau Chappelle. And that experience at Morneau Chappelle is where I would say I really was starting to think about the concept of psych safety. So I wasn't where you were at, like you were in the game at 2013. I probably really heard about the standard in 2013, and I was starting to pay attention. But I would say the penny drop for me that this was a passion, a really interest for me, was probably with 2014, 2015. That's kind of how I got into it, and with Morneau Chappelle, and I did work with the Conference Board of Canada, and now with Howatt HR. That's all we folks focus on. We're a little small boutique firm, about 20 of us, that specializes in this, helping employers learn how to reduce mental harm and promote mental health through using the Plan, Do, Check, Act approach.
Yeah, that's great. Something you said, I've read Deming's work, but I've never heard it described as remove fear. And yet you can't be psychologically safe unless fear has been removed. So that's a really great, succinct way to describe it. And then all the other things come. I feel supported. I feel somebody's got my back. That's why I don't have fear. So it's a great description. But what a long and winding road, Bill. And yeah. It is funny because it does mirror my own. I mean, I started off in business, not in psych health and safety, and doing all the stuff and making all the mistakes. So it's interesting. But you said 2013, I started with psych safety, but that's not true. It was actually 2004, if wow. You can imagine, where the concept of WHMIS, which is Workplace Hazardous Materials Training, and Glenn, for the life of me, his last name's escaping me, but he at the time was the acting CEO of CMHA Ontario. And he said to me, one day you're going to see mental health, psychological health protected like we do with hazardous materials. And that's where the idea first came from for me. So long incubation period.
I'm not surprised you've been at this so much longer than I have. I'm just excited to have a chance to talk to you about this, because I don't know if you like, I've heard someone refer you to the grandmother of the thing in Canada. I don't know if you like that.
Excuse me, it's godmother. Not grandmother, Bill. I'll just, yeah. Godmother's okay with my Sicilian heritage. Grandmother, not so much. Yeah. Okay. But yeah, it was Mark Hennick coined that term. Godmother.
I just thought it was flattering. Whatever. Yeah. I think is right.
So let's talk about your work today and what you're doing and how it connects to psychological health and safety.
Yeah, great question. So one of the things that our approach at this is, I think where you and I are aligned, and again, correct me if I misstep in this place, but I'm a super fan of the CSA standard. Of a management system, but I don't think you need to have a management system to have a whole lot of impact in organizations. I think you need to be intentional. I think you need to have an idea of what you're doing. And so the approach we take with organizations when they ask us to support them is the following. I try to take a very simplistic approach. I try to, first of all, help them understand that what are the levers an employer can pull. But if you're going to actually start to be aware of what levers you can pull before you get to that point, understand where you're going to start. So for example, when we use a concept, I believe, of psychosocial factors and hazards, or hazards and risk, they're not mutually inclusive, but they're very interdependent. Like, people sometimes confuse and use the terms interchangeably. So I'll say to an employer, for example, if your calling or wanting to impact psychological health and safety, what's your North Star? What's your purpose? Why? What are you looking to do? What's like really simplistic? What's your suggestion? And one of the CEOs said to me, he said, Bill, I'm not quite sure. It's like, how about I give you something to think about? And I said, sure, let's start with this. It may not be right for you. He said, what percentage of your employees come to work because they want to and they have purpose? And what percentage of your workers come because they feel they need a paycheck and they may not feel valued? He goes, oh my heavens, Bill, I don't want to answer that question. I said, okay, but let's imagine it's 50-50. What's it worth to start helping to ensure that the folks that come because they value and purpose, we help maintain those folks? And the people that may not be, and it may nothing be to do with you or your employment. It could be other personal issues, it could be life, it could be other challenges. We can help them have an experience where they can feel over here. Because at the end of the day, I don't believe psychological health and safety is something you do off the side of the desk. I think it's like occupational health and safety. It's integrated in everything we do. So every interaction the employee has in the workplace is the employee experience. So I said, let's focus on the employee experience. And let's just think about it. And some people, and I say this, and you and I have talked about it, but my belief is that if everything we do with our employees, we have an intention. So for example, why do we do rewards programs? Why do we do recognition programs? Why do we create policies? Well, either we're trying to create emotions, because human beings are really emotional, trying to create more pleasant emotions that help them feel, because human beings, when they're in pleasant emotions, they anchor that with being a safe place. And so that can help them flourish, because we know the environment can help people build resiliency and feel support through the social determinants of health. And then on the other side, it's the mental harm. It's just not respectful workplace policies. But what about how we organize work? Like I said to them, they said, do you know globally, the UN recently said that 2.8 million employees die per year because of how we organize work? We're killing people from overworking people. Now, when a small country of 38 million last count, we may not have context. So what we end up doing is I start with that frame of reference that my role is to help you figure out what can we do with intention that can create more emotions, pleasant emotions, people want to come to work, and mitigate harm that could inhibit or hurt people or put them on disability or want to leave or quit. So attraction, retention, all those great things. But then I say to them, how we do that is very simplistic. So we have to understand what the factors are in the organization, like what, and let's sit down and talk to your employees, say, okay, what is your stressors? Instead of just randomly picking, what's going on with you? And we find the 5 or 6 and we measure them. And then we say, okay, the consequence of those, for example, work demand, people are working too long. What's the consequence of that? Well, that's a psychosocial factor. People are fatigued. People are getting burnt out. People are making mistakes. People are going on disability leave or so those are your issues. So you have your upstream. I said, before we do anything, we need to make a decision about if we discover there's an issue, are we willing to invest in putting programs and policies into dealing with it? Because measuring something without a plan or having a clue of what you're going to do will create more frustration. And that's why we have this concept of survey fatigue. It's no such thing as survey fatigue. It's called survey regret, because employees are actually contributing points of view without any evidence we're doing anything. So my approach real quickly, we do the pre-frame. I need to believe intrinsically the senior person cares. I'm at the point in my career, and you are too, I just don't, it's not about a paycheck for me anymore. So I work with organizations where I believe I look the senior person in the eye and say, okay, you're someone who cares. I can work with you. Then I start teaching. Then once we understand the factors and the hazards, then the moderators, those are your levers. Those are your protective factors. What are your protective factors for supports? What are your protective factors for prevention? And the last part, Marianne, I say, I'm really pushing to differentiate between transactional prevention and transformational prevention. We need to stop thinking that if I go to an employee and say, hey, I know resiliency is an issue, we're going to give you a 3-hour workshop. That's the equivalent of occupational health and safety and say, listen, we're going to remind you to put your hard hat on once. Like, we need to realize that the world you knew I operate in, Marianne, is about creating habits. And it's about how to create a place that people can develop habits. And it's not just about creating intention, which is important, that's awareness. When that moves into the accountability, what does the worker own? What does the employer own? How do they work together? And then what's the plan? Now we got our plan. What are we going to do? And then here's the big one. And I think many people are missing a C. Is what we're doing actually working for the worker? Do we have any evidence of what we're doing is working? So, and then they adjust. And I think, Marianne, many people have great intention, but they may be doing more, like thinking, layering on, I don't know, I'll be interested in your thing, layering on a whole bunch of programs without actually knowing if the top three perhaps are working.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you, Bill. But for our listeners, can you go back and talk a little bit more about what makes something a protective factor?
Yeah, 100%. So when you start thinking about a protective factor, those are things that can actually help, the employer can do to help mitigate risk or promote. So let's look at something, give a good example of a protective factor approach. So let's say, for example, we collect our data and we figure out the psychosocial factor is work demand. Lots of folks talk about work demand. And then in our data, we start to find out that we're having more short-term disability and we're having a long-term disability, and we're having more people talk about burnout, and we're losing our engagement score. So we figure out what's going on. The protective factor, for example, maybe if these folks are remote, we'll take that. One thing is, how are we training leaders to be able to facilitate leading and interacting with the remote workforce? Because the manager-employee relationship is, from a social perspective, can be a protective factor. So having a manager I feel psychologically safe with, that I can feel comfortable talking to, I can ask questions, I can push back with, I can have some discourse with, I can say how I really feel, and I'm not caught in silence where I feel I'm going to be judged or evaluated. That relationship can be a protective factor. An authentic connection with a peer can be a protective factor. A respectful workplace policy can be a protective factor. A remote work policy, mental fitness training that on behavioral health to help employees. Because, for example, in the world of occupational health and safety, the last line of defense is PPE. But in the world of psychological safety, the last line of defense is personal psychological protection. 1000%, here's a mistake some people are making, 1000% supporting employees to build resilience is critical. However, I don't care how resilient you are, you're still possibly going to have challenging days, which is okay. And if you're in a toxic workplace where people are bullies and harassment, that can wear even the most resilient person down. So I feel we've got to learn how to realize that protective factors come from the environment as well as intrinsically. But I should be able to raise my hand and say, hey, dude, hey, Marianne, I'm really tired today. My resiliency, I need time for me. And that's to me is that dance. We're not there yet in a lot of organizations.
So one of the things that somebody might say is maybe they run a grocery store and the cashier says, I'm tired today, I need some time. What's a leader in a grocery store supposed to do with that?
Yeah, I think that's the first thing you can say to if this is a real good question is in real time, what might happen is sometimes is fatigue, as we often sometimes when someone needs a break, they often need a state change. So from leading many people over the years and yourself too. So if someone's in a situation where they just had a customer and their response to you is, I'm tired, I need to go home, or I need a break, they're probably caught in unpleasant emotions. And they're probably going into the protective factor themselves, self-protection. And when a person is in that self-protection state, instead of reacting to it, one of the things we can kind of do is give them some space to help them sort, because we all know when you get caught in emotions, is that we need some time to move from those maladaptive, I'm no good, I can't cope, I got to get out of here and run, to where I'm more adaptive. Okay, I just had a challenging situation, rename it. So one thing the leader might have the training is to say, hey, why don't you go take 10 minutes? I'll take over for you now. We'll get to this, I'll get through this line of the customers, get these folks. Let's sit down and have a chat and see how we're doing. So by giving a person a state change and then recalibrate in real time, if a leader just has a little bit of training to realize as human beings, this is what's really emotionally cool about us from emotional literacy. We can be happy one moment and pissed the next, and to be happy the next moment. So if we actually understand that sometimes when someone needs a rest, it could be 5 minutes, it could be 10 minutes, but let's not confuse neurological fatigue. Like, for example, if you're staying up for 18 hours in a row or 20 hours, at 24 hours, your physiology is at almost the same level as someone who's impaired at 0.08 alcohol. So that is a different scenario. Someone like this stayed up all night, and that's where we want to make sure, Marianne, that leader actually understands impairment in the workplace and how to support that as well. And that's another level of training. But I think to answer your question, we don't need leaders to become psychological experts. We just sometimes need them to put the people back into the relationship. And sometimes, and I've learned this, and you have too, because I've led big teams, is that the price for not taking 10 minutes to deal with a human issue and to drive through it, to push them, and it could result in 30 days of them being off because you break the situation and put them through threshold. I think just realizing we are in a pandemic and people's frontal lobes are already tired, and a lot of people are living in the cortisol levels are already pretty high. Lots of people are living high. And the thing, Marianne, many of the listeners may not know, you're hearing the word burnout a lot. It's being misused, the term. Because what happens is there's two types of stress. There's eustress, good stress, that kind of gets you up. You need cortisol to get you going. Cortisol is better than for you in the morning than coffee. If you're going to have your coffee, I encourage people, I like to have my morning coffee from habit, but if you're already anxious, morning coffee, let your own natural cortisol kick your day off. But if you get under a stress response, your cortisol levels will increase. And then that's where people think they have a superpower and they push through themselves and all that kind of stuff. But as your cortisol start to lower because of fatigue, if your cortisol start to drop, then you're at real risk for burnout. That's what people with burnout have, low levels of cortisol. So what I'm learning and watching, and I'm interested in what you think, is Maslow's continuum burnout between apathy, I just don't know how I'm going to do it anymore, uncertainty, and interpersonal dependency, like what Amy Edmondson talked about for years. Those are two big factors for psych safety. And burnout is that concept of fatigue. And I'm concerned about compassion fatigue. Because I think what's happening is some of us are running out of empathy for ourselves and empathy for other people. And I think a part of it is because we're not spending enough time intentionally unplugging to charge our battery.
Mm-hmm. I know for myself, Bill, because I am a self-professed workaholic, meaning I love to work. It's more fun for me than watching TV or I like the stuff that I do. But because I did burn out many years ago, I keep hearing, take time for yourself. You need to have a break. You need to have, and I really find 1 minute, literally 60 seconds with my eyes closed in the middle of a really busy day can be enough. And I can do it as often as I want. And so I think everybody's got to figure it out. Everybody's got to figure out how to deal with it. But I think there's no doubt that many more people are feeling burned out now than they were. But I want to ask you, Bill, when you're dealing with, I say old school, but it's not always older people, but those who feel the command and control model, never let them see you sweat. I'm the one in charge. I will make this happen. And I'm going to get you to pull yourself up by your bootstraps leader. How do you help them when they don't even know their own emotions? They're not good with the emotions of their family and friends. How do you help them to become the kind of leader that's actually psychologically safe?
I I'm going to say something that I'm going to give you my way of doing it that may not be for everyone else. I'm going to pre-frame it that way. But one of the things I do know is that being a 6'2" white male with a bunch of degrees as an older guy, I come into the room with a certain presence with these senior folks. I do this a lot. I get called in to deal with a lot of folks. But one of the things I really want them to know is that I'm a bartender's son, and I lived my entire life with a mental illness. And it took me till I was 50 years old to understand that I actually was able to like myself. And the vulnerability of all the issues I've dealt with around how we overcompensate and how we sometimes as leaders, because what happens is, I don't care. And I've had the privilege of working with billionaires to, like all kinds of people like you, to frontline folks. And here's what I believe about all of us are the same. When our self-esteem goes down, our ego goes up. We go into self-protection. And all of us, regardless of our coat. So if I'm wearing a sweater today talking to you, and that's my persona that I put under, but underneath, I'm still a human being. So what I do is I kind of go in the front door and I actually talk about to folks, and I actually talk about stories around what I find fascinating is the command and control approach of how it happens. And what some people talk about what it is, but they actually don't spend time talking about why it happens. And why it often happens is because they're driven towards a financial goal or an outcome. And when they ever see a difference between what they want and what they have, it creates fear that will define them, and they're starting to fail. So what happens is they go into unpleasant emotions. And when you're on unpleasant emotions, you increase your risk for creating interpersonal disruption with someone else. In other words, you're more focused on what you want than how you're going to get what you want. And so what a command control is not giving space to the other person's consideration, because you're so caught up in your consideration that I'm the expert, I'm the only one. Now, what's really cool for us is we're starting to realize that the folks that you're talking to, you can't change them unless it hits their heartstring. And I have found that if you can get folks start thinking about how their behavior, their leadership weight, the possibility of what they're doing could be creating harm to other people, their experience. And I said the same thing. So, and I used an example. I had one guy that was really, really hard. I said, if a terrorist walk in this room right now, there's a high probability you and I are both going to be scared. Why? Because we don't feel we're in control. Now, you're a very senior person. Someone walks in your room and you're yelling and screaming, or what you do, so you carry on, you're a bully. And you need to name that to someone. And that's called social dominance theory. And a lot of leaders don't know what they're doing, is we talk about it. It doesn't work for all the time, Marianne, but I do believe that's why I pre-framed. My approach is, I've lived it in Wall Street for a long time. I did it in forensics. And I really realized that a lot of folks forget the following. They'll say some people are just mortified when they hear their behavior hurting other people. And I actually say to them, that's a good sign that you have empathy, but it's not what you believe you're doing. It's how it's being received. And then I really talk to them about the values of the organization. After I do my little pre-frame, I go to the wall and I ask, do you believe those values? And are those things that you actually use to make decisions? And are you holding yourself accountable and practicing them? And are you talking to your employees about it? Because that's really that minimal standard of how we actually want to interact. And let's not assume those words on the wall, we actually know what they mean. Let's talk about them. And then the following I said to them is, just because you have a conversation, let's assume that for the next 4 or 5, 6 months, you're learning. There's only 3 questions I want you to get. And this is where I find it breaks the ice. I want you to answer these 3 questions. I want you to talk to every one of your employees about how they can correct you, how they can provide feedback to you, and how they can share their concerns with you. And if we can figure out how to do that, then I feel we start to knock down some of that kind of perception of command and control, if they're open to it, of course. I'd be interested what you think about it.
Well, I was a teenager working as a receptionist in an organization. And just down the hall, but like 4 or 5 offices down the hall, was the managing partner. And he would call in grown men to his office, leave the door open, and I could hear him screaming at them. I could hear him yelling at them and really putting them down. And I'd watch the men come out, and many of them ended up with blood pressure issues, with rashes on their face. You could tell that their nerves were shot. And at that age, I knew nothing about psychological health and safety. I knew nothing even about mental health, but it really struck me that this was even something that was allowed, that people could treat each other like that. Now, I think today that may happen less, but what I see now is it's done in a much more almost more intense, because they're holding in, they can't raise their voice, but there's still very much that anger, that fear, that taking it out on people that happens. Fortunately, a lot less than it ever did before, but yeah, it really impressed upon me at that young age that to treat somebody like that couldn't possibly improve their performance. That and you know, I read Daniel Pink's book Drive, and there he talks about that the external reward, the external punishment, the fear of punishment did work when we were on an assembly line building widgets, because it narrows our focus. But when we narrow the focus of somebody who is supposed to be interacting with other people, who's supposed to be creative, who's supposed to be analytical, that we're actually reducing their performance. So, but the taking somebody from that approach to genuinely seeing a different way to do it. Some of what I've found is useful is really tapping into what their frustrations are. You know, what is it that is difficult for them? What's the part of their job they don't like? And then trying to give them a solution to that. Then often they can hear that differently than they can hear criticism about themselves.
Well, I'll add to that. I'll add to it real quick, Marion. I agree with you 100%. That unpleasant emotion or that fear that's driving, I love what you say. If you can help them with that. I actually feel, though, they need to be aware of the possibility of how what they're doing is impacting others, and that's not cool. And if we can get to the point where their awareness, that's not cool, and that's not how they want to define themselves, then we can, to your point, but start teaching. However, we have to remember something. I pre-framed them. I said, listen, and I said, I have a senior guy the other day who was a bit of a screamer. And I said to him, I said, well, I kind of lost my cool. And I said, well, habits take time. Did you fix it? Yeah, I apologize really, or I called them right away and I apologized. Yeah, what they say, they were really grateful. And they said, well, you weren't even that bad. I said, well, it's not kind of cool. They're kind of calibrating you now over time. It's that emotional bank account too, Marianne. It's like it's kind of marriage too, is the same one. Like every time you do something great for your partner, you get 1 credit. And every time you do something that's, that perceived as a slight, you lose 10. So managers, if they pay attention to the emotional piggy bank they have with their workers, that will help insulate that experience where they feel safe. And that's kind of a protective factor, because then you're a safe channel if they need help to talk to.
Right. If they trust your intention, you can make a mistake. But if they don't, then yes, you're right. That bank account just gets depleted really fast. Bill, you keep talking about emotions. And I remember reading your book, The Cure for Loneliness, and thinking, this is way beyond a cure for loneliness. And I'm wondering if you can share some of the principles, some of the ideas that were in that book that could help people who don't even identify as lonely.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mariana, and I appreciate your endorsement for that book as well. It's one of the things that I will say to you is that fascinated me. I wrote this book because of what I've learned in psychological health and safety, and I wrote it thinking about workers. And before COVID, serendipitously with WorkSafe Prevention Service and the Globe and Mail had done some research on looking at the difference between isolation and loneliness. And I think isolation is what we perceive as a barrier that prevents us from having relationships with other people. But what I discovered in this, when I'm going through it, the byproduct is loneliness, and loneliness is very subjective. It's very individual. And I started off with the stereotypical thinking loneliness of people are alone, but you can be with people on teams and have all these smiley and interacting, but be alone. You can be in a marriage and be alone. And then what hit me, one of my biggest insights from this, and was interesting, Ryan, the CEO of Adversity, who gave me an endorsement on this, said something to me. He called me, he said, Bill, as a psychiatrist, I want to tell you what I believe your contribution to the literature was from this. And I go, what's that? I'm pretty excited. He said, I've never heard anybody explain the social connection charge like you did in your book. And I said, well, what did you like about it, Ryan? He said, because you really anchored that you can't have a relationship with other people unless you invest in your relationship with yourself to start. And when you wake up in the morning, if you love yourself, which sounds corny to some males, I know males, and one of the things, Marianne, I'm going to preface something because I know that you and I both deeply care about this, death by suicide. We really, with all the inclusion we're doing is great stuff, but we still have males between 40 years old and 50, still the #1 population that are taking their own life. And a part of this is what I'm talking about now, is all the stereotypical about what a male's supposed to do, about having their emotions. And Yale talks a great deal about emotional literacy. So I spend a lot of time with folks talking about emotional literacy to develop a relationship with yourself, how to do that. However, you also have casual relationships, you have work relationships, you have familiar relationships, and your partner. And the quality of those relationships collectively can contribute to your mental health, because the algorithm of mental health, from my perspective, is the environment, which I talk about in the book, your physical health, exercise, diet, rest, lifestyle choices, and sleep, your mental fitness, what you do to create pleasant emotions, deal with at-risk behaviors, mitigate, you don't need to eat, like, pay attention to the habits that could hurt you, and help-seeking behaviors. But these authentic connections, because we're genetically driven for love. All of us, unless you're a psychopath and a sociopath, it's in your DNA to be loved. And in the absence of relationships where you feel connection and safe and valued and purpose and recognized and understood, that is a gap. And human beings only have 2 mindsets they're in. 1, they're in focal work mode, or 2, they're in social mode. And when they're not in social mode, then they need to figure out what they're going to do with their time, of how they're going to entertain themselves, or do something you said that I think is critical wisdom. Allow themselves to be bored, because we human beings are micro shifting every 45 seconds because of neural default network in the brain. They're moving too fast. But the book really talks about the following: how to help people charge their own social connection battery by themselves through the relationships. However, dealing from a cognitive behavioral approach, learning how their thinking and their emotions can create self-talk and limited beliefs that can prevent them from liking themselves or liking other people. And while we learn how to develop relationships, resiliency is really important. Because here's the deal with relationships. You get to decide if you like me, and I get to decide if I like you. And that's the challenge. The greatest gift in the world is when someone likes you that you like. And one of the greatest pains in our life is when someone you like, they don't like you. And so human beings, the juxtaposition of navigating interpersonal relationships, because for me, mental illness is the impairment for mental illness. And I ask people, so what is the impairment for mental illness? And I go, what do you mean, Bill? Don't tell me symptom load. That's not the impairment. The impairment is the inability for me to function and interact with my external world at the level I would like to, or my internal world. And so we use relationships to navigate being a human being. That's our safe haven. That's when we have those anchor relationships. I mean, like, you can be in a really, really feeling insecure and, worried and caught up in some old thinking. You can sit with someone you really value and trust, and they can just listen to you, just very much like the grocery store example, and give you that 5 minutes. And then you kind of go, oh, okay. And you said what you say, and they're still there, and they're still with you. That sometimes no words, just that emotional support from someone you can value can actually matter. And I believe, Marianne, with what the UN just put out recently, I was reading it, that 50% of remote workers right now are experiencing isolation and loneliness. Introverts are starting to struggle because the least going to work forced them out to have some interaction, with casual interaction. I do believe that from a psychological health and safety perspective, leaders need to be mindful of the role of culture around isolation and loneliness, and don't take it for granted, and don't assume that employees are doing okay. I'm hoping that this is a conversation employers will continue to ask over and over. Do you have folks you feel comfortable with? Because I 100% believe we need to have those to thrive.
Yeah, one of the things that you said that really has hit me in a way that is profound is that the antidote to loneliness isn't more people. The antidote to loneliness is you being your authentic self, but it starts with being authentic with yourself. And if you're beating yourself up, you're not being authentic. You are being critical, you're being judgmental. And if you can be authentic with yourself, oh, okay, I didn't do that well. I should have said something different. And I think I was just too tired. But you start there, and then you go to be authentic with somebody else, anybody else. And it doesn't mean you have to find your so-called soulmate or the love of your life. It just means there has to be another human being that you can be authentically you with. And so that's the cure for loneliness. Now you're working on a new book. What are you going to share with us there?
Yeah, the new book. So the new book is called No Regrets. And what I'm really focusing on the book, No Regrets, is that there's two types of regrets human beings have, and no regrets. Regret is taking regrets for the listener. Regret is perhaps one of the most transformational, unpleasant emotions we have that are missed opportunities. So what I mean by what is regret? So something that happens in your life, let's say a relationship, and all of a sudden your partner breaks up with you. Your partner breaks up because you supposedly did A, B, and C. And your regret is, oh, I should have not done that. And you can spend your life caught in a loop, or you can use that experience and say, what can I learn from that? Because what we have to do as human beings to move on, and that's how we thrive, is we're going to fail. We're not perfect. So when we make mistakes in our life, there is no redos. You can replay something a bazillion times, and you're not going to change yesterday. And what happened yesterday, it's okay to go through emotions and grief and loss and all those things. That's very human, but it doesn't change yesterday. But what we can learn from it? What are the gifts that we can take to apply to our next relationship, so we don't replicate the same mistake over and over? So how do we evolve? So interestingly, the regret that really hurts people the most is the things they wish they would have done and they didn't do because of fear. Like, I was stuck in a job and I didn't do my degree, or I wanted to have children, but I didn't. And the things they didn't try. So the concept of no regret is the third part of a trilogy. The first book, Stop Hiding, was about fear. The second book is on authentic connections. The third book, No Regrets, is a concept around helping people around emotional well-being, how to navigate their emotions and their thinking to deal with no regret. Because my belief is, I'm fascinated with a concept called languishing and how languishing works. 1 in 5 Canadians before COVID had a mental health issue, which we all know. What we don't all talk about is 7 out of 10 of the 1 in 5 never asked for help. And what we also don't talk is about 60% of our workforce at any given time are in a state of blah, that are kind of getting by, and they're feeling they're caught in unpleasant emotions. Well, the three factors for me that move beyond languishing, and that's my area where I'm going to start really focusing, because I believe employers have spent a lot of time with support systems, cognitive behavior therapy, millions of dollars, employee assistance program. Those are all support programs. Where I don't think employers are spending enough time is targeted transformational prevention. A great example, Weight Watchers, targeted transformational prevention. Identified issue, individuals, not saying every employee has the same issue. We're EAP, every employee gets it. But I believe they should have that, extended benefits. But I also think we're going to remove stigma if we can move to the world of targeted mental fitness, where some employees realize, you know what, I might need some help with how do I build and maintain my relationship, move that forward. But the three that I'm fascinated with, that I really want to work with, is languishing. Because disability management in our country last year, insurance companies over forecasted with actuaries who are brilliantly smart, $150 million was spent by all the big insurance companies in disability. And my sense is when I look at what's called worker comp claims, I start thinking about mental injuries. I start thinking about short-term disability. I start thinking about long-term disability and thinking about how big the ship is. So you and I are going to spend our time talking about employers about what they can do. Critically important. We have to burn the rope at the other end. How can we get the workers to help them with personal psychological protection to deal with languishing? And the area of the regret is where we're going to be moving towards, is how to help employers target languishing, target isolation and loneliness, and then help every employee, in my humble opinion, that I think is critical, is we talk about mental fitness, but we're talking about that for 100 years. And, you know, we still have obesity and type 2 diabetes, but how do we help employees intentionally build mental fitness? How do we help them solve those problems? But here's what I've learned, Marianne, from 30 years of clinical work. And I know you have a clinical background too. If you go to an employee and say, hey, here's a program, follow it. And here's an app, go use it. People need people. And why therapy and counseling works, because people have accountability, have a support system, have a Q&A. Because the work doesn't really happen in therapy. If you know what I'm saying. It's the experience in therapy, and it's the work that happens between therapy that creates the evolution, the transfer. Like, I don't really do much. I'm a conduit to an opportunity as a therapist. What happens is transformation for me, or that's why I did this book, is I'm super excited about how do we help employers sit and say, I get 60% of my population. How do I create a path for them to create transformation and build in attrition, slipping, failing, and being a human being, to teach to do three things: remove regret. That's why a lot of people languish and they have a regret. Authentic connection. I'm lonely, or I don't have a relationship. I don't feel lovable. I don't feel worthy. I don't feel like myself, like you said. Got to like yourself first. The third one, fear. Fear of not being good enough. Fear. If we can help those three, I think we can help people develop more resiliency and move, as Keys talked about, to flourishing.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yes, Corey Keyes brought that forward. I remember sitting in Calgary, listening to him for the first time, and it was like this light bulb went on, that we don't have to be diagnosed to be languishing, just not enjoying life at all. And we don't have to be diagnosed to be flourishing either, where we can really ride the waves of whatever life throws at us and see it, as you say, as a challenge, an opportunity for growth, rather than the disappointment of a lifetime that we just are able to. I used to be able to look 10 years ago and learn from what happened. Then it was that I could look at something that happened months ago and learn. And today I'm able to look at it in the moment most of the time and say, this is a challenge. I wonder what I'm supposed to get out of this. So
Well,
that's.
Share a quote with you real quick from Adam Granaher, just supports what you just said. The the absence of mental illness doesn't mean mental health.
Right.
That's just what you said is brilliant. I agree with 100%.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why you think, well, 1 in 5 might have a diagnosis, but what about all the other people who can't sleep at night, have repetitive negative thoughts, repetitive fearful thoughts? That there's so much to be said around that. Bill, I know we're getting short on time, but I really wanted you to share a little bit about the impairment standard that you worked on.
Oh, is that
And
2008?
yeah,
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 happy to.
how would an average business owner want to use that or learn from that?
Oh, the great question. So the Z1008 came out of initiative with Healthcare Canada working with CSA Standard. It was around the nationalizing of cannabis and bringing it, moving it into mainstream. There were some concerns wanting to ensure that, hey, we believe that this is the right thing to do as a government, but what we want to do is we can't put in major controls, but we want to put in some tools to support small, large, and mid-sized business to understand how to deal with workplace impairment. So CSA, which you know lots about, well, they've created the Z1003, which they're updating next year, which is that it was on how to facilitate psychological health and safety in the workplace. One element of psychological health and safety would be dealing with employees who may or may not have substance use issues in the workplace. But we also wanted to make sure, okay, substance are one thing, but someone could be actually their medication. They might be on a wrong medication, or they could be fatigued. And so what we really wanted to do with this is to create a tool that CSA got funding for that is a free, no cost standard for the word that provides a standard, an implementation guide and training that can guide employers on how to create policies in dealing with workplace impairment that consider the employer's needs and the workers' needs to protect. So that if, for example, if an employee showed up in a workplace and was staggering, is to provide a framework of how to prepare leaders, of how to support that employee, because the very first thing we want to do is protect that employee, protect themselves and then protect them from other people, and then get them to a place where we can stabilize and ensure that they're safe, and then put in provisions. Now, if the person has a substance use disorder, under human rights, they're protected. And under human rights, the same as someone with depression or anxiety, there's a duty to accommodate, and there's a process. However, what this is really about, Marianne, is helping employers get a framework. And I would say that Z1008, the impairment standard, and Z1003, the psych safe standard, those two are work together in my mind that can complement, because they both, if you were actually really adopting a standard, you would need to use 45,001. That's your management system. These are guides to facilitate inside a management system. But if you're looking to adapt or make decisions on it, both those documents can help you in your planning and things to consider. And I thought the committee that worked on it were very diligent. And I will say again, if you Google CSA Z1003, Canadian Standards Association Z1003, you can, with no cost, download the standard and implementation guide and training in French and in English.
So Z1003 is the national standard on psych health and safety. Z1008 is the impairment standard.
Correct.
Great. So that's good. So before I ask you my last question, is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners today?
Yeah, thanks for that opportunity. I think the one thing when I was thinking about this is that I'd like to throw out a little bit of hope that I believe the pandemic has been hard on us. I believe that there's all kinds of evidence that says, our employees are getting, it's harder. There's all kinds of data saying that anxiety is going up, depression's going up. And I think over the last, 5, 8, 10 years, I've been paying attention is that lots of employers are doing the plan. They're starting to get some data and they're doing the plan and the do. What I would ask employers to start considering is that we're going to get through this, but however, is more may not necessarily be better, meaning that I'll go to some employers and they have 60 programs. And I'll say, I know your care. Let's ask a couple of questions. When are employees allowed to use the programs? When do they have access? When are they accessing the programs? C, are we doing focus groups and listening tours to see if they actually value what we're doing? I get there's a group of people making beautiful PowerPoints. I'm not trying to be pejorative and working together. I love that energy and effort. But my question I often ask is a wellness committee, are you role modeling yourself, taking care of your own mental health? Or do you have your own plan? Do you use the programs you're promoting? Are you convinced? Are you creating testimonials? So I really feel that we need to move from activity and follow some of the wisdom that came from Kip Patrick. Level 0, yeah, great idea, theory informed evidence. Level 1, yeah, employees attended, value investment. We have 90% of our employees take this training. Level 2, hey, can they remember anything from the training? Could they pass some type of comprehension test in 30 days? But here's really where we need to do. Level 3, can they take the policy training, the program, and apply it to their own life? Are they using it? Are we correcting for the forgetting curve? Do we actually know what the forgetting curve is? Meaning human beings will only learn what they value. So they take some repetition, takes about 260 days to develop a new habit. Forget anyone ever told you 21 days. That's a lie. It's an illusion. Human beings take time to learn. And once we can start moving to that C, start doing program evaluation and really getting to the worker. And what I really enjoyed about reading 45,003 and listening to some of the recommendations is how important is to continue to talk to the worker over and over and over and over and over. Is what we doing working? And then go to act, adjust it, and then begin the train and keep running the buses. And please, for the love of God, Marianne, if we can just get people to realize that psychological health and safety is going to be just like occupational health and safety. Is you take a hard hat and we talk about it every bloody day. Why? Because we don't want them to forget their PPE. Then we need to take the same thinking, because human beings are the same. It's for personal psychological protection. Every day a CEO can say, what are we doing that's creating positive for employees? Where are our drains? Every day we can be looking at behaviors, how we organizing work, how we providing feedback, how are we staffing? Are we having employees that we continue to have shortages that we're giving them too much? Like, pay attention to the employee experience through plan, do, check, act. So last of my little tirade I have, let's get really big C's. Let's really get after C. Program evaluation, evidence, measure, test 1, test 2, and let's learn how to really get results. That's, I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's where my brain is at right now.
Yeah, it's something that we've talked about for years, that the lunch and learn may be a value to get people to start thinking, but if you don't actually encourage them to act on it, and that comes before the training, where you say to somebody, I'm going to ask you to come back and report what you've learned. And then after the training, I want you to report how you applied it. It's a simple little addition that makes all the difference in the effect. So Bill, here's your last question. And that is, when you're speaking to a layperson, somebody who has no idea what psych health and safety in the workplace is,
yeah,
how would you describe what it's going to look like, what it's going to feel like?
It's a place when you start to walk up the stairs, you have your emotions that you feel intrinsically. It's a place where you are attracted to. It's a place where you start to get closer, you get a little bit more excited, because you're going to be around people who you value, who value you. You're going to be in a place where silence, we're secrets, and people talk around coolers about everything that sucks. That doesn't really happen. If people have concerns, they'll raise their hand. It's okay to say, you know what, Marianne, I know you're really passionate about that. I know you're my boss, but I just don't agree with you on this. Is that I can actually have discourse, very much like what they learned from the Google Aristotle research, that teams that are allowed to come together and can have some rumbling and understand that while we're rumbling, it's okay for us both to be frustrated and be angry. And it's not, those emotions are not bad emotions. Those are emotions are great. Anger, emotion, frustration, those are great emotions. It's not the emotions, what we do with them. And so if we're allowed to say, you know what, I'm getting really pissed about this conversation, I'm getting it's okay. But as long as both people are in the same conversation and I'm not using it to control. So it's a place where I feel that I'm included, I'm welcomed, I'm safe, I'm valued, and they care. And it's not a place where we just talk about saying we care about our employees and we talk about saying how valuable our employees are. We have CEOs and senior people who walk down and sit down and say, hey, Bob, how are you? Hey, Jill, hi. Do you know who I am? Do you know what I believe in? And that we create a community that people come because they want. That's in my vision of when you think about a psychological safe place. And guess what? It also is. When things go wrong, which they will, we don't place blame. We figure out that human beings will make mistakes. So finally, what a psychological safe is a learning culture. It's a place where we learn, we grow, and we evolve. And we're committed to continuous improvement. And we actually know, without a shadow of a doubt, the best laid plan may not work and it may not be convenient. So we have to make a new plan or adjust. And so we just understand that we anticipate there are going to be challenges. And we don't live in this kind of fake glass ceiling that employees are supposed to just do exactly what we tell them all the time and agree with what we say all the time and be happy with us all the time. No, it's a place that we're coming together for a common purpose. And I think, Marianne, that's why you're going to start to see ESGs and governance reporting starting to be used by many more organizations. The environment, the social, and governance. If you start to see what's happening in Europe, the S, the workers' well-being, the experience of workers, of what workers will talk about around corruption, what they talk about their experience, about how they feel valued, investors and customers for sustainability, where they're going to put the dollars in. They're starting to say, hey, you can't do this unless you have employees. And we need, the finances are fine, but we need to know what you're doing to protect your employees, not some bunch of activities, but how does it tie to your purpose and what's your plan of how you're going to measure it. So I'm pretty excited about what I just talked about. I think the UN, even people, planet, profit. I think we're starting to get it. You actually need human beings to be successful.
Yeah, very good. And we'll end on that. I will say to the listeners that they'll be able to see the clips from this on the Flourish DX LinkedIn. They can get in touch with you on LinkedIn, and that the entire podcast will be on psychhealthandsafetycanada.com. So thanks very much, Bill Howatt. And
thanks for having me. Always, I was so excited to do this. So just an honor to actually have something that I'll be able to listen to with us. So grateful. Keep doing all the amazing work you're doing. It's so important.